Hi, I'm Nathaniel Jeanson. You're about to watch me give a presentation on evolution and replacing Darwin in front of a live, primarily Christian and creationist audience. If you're neither of those categories, I have a special welcome for you. You'll hear me make the case for evolution and then give the major creationist arguments against it. If I make the case for evolution accurately, I hope you'll consider why that is the case, especially being a creationist myself. I also hope you'll listen to the part where I give the modern creationist arguments against it. In my experience, my evolutionary colleagues and the leading evolutionists around the planet aren't familiar with these arguments. I think it'll give you much to think about. Part of this talk is also sermon, where I tell Christians and show them why this issue is so important. I think you'll find much stimulating there as well. If you'd like to dig deeper, I invite you to read my book, Replacing Darwin, and visit the Facebook page by the same name. I set this up specifically for engaging those who disagree with me. Hope you'll enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much. I spent 6 years of my life in the liberal Northeast, the part of the country which has some of the lowest church attendance levels of the whole nation. That and the Northwest are probably the lowest levels, not like the Bible Belt, not like Kentucky. That was for my PhD work at Harvard. And it was so liberal, it's almost laughable. I was working in a stem cell lab. There were pro-life issues that came up, so I was invited to speak at a pro-life conference on the stem cell question. In that part of the country, it was mostly run by Catholics rather than evangelicals, and did my little part as part of a panel discussion, but also got to listen to some of the other keynote speakers. One of them gave an update on the state of pro-life legislation in Massachusetts. And he said it was so leftward that the way the legislative body in the Massachusetts State House decided what to do next was to figure out what the conservatives were against and then legislate for it. That was their strategy. Liberal place to be. So it wouldn't surprise you probably to learn that the church I attended placed a heavy emphasis on street evangelism, going out and talking to people on the street about the faith, trying to win people to Christianity, to Jesus. So we'd run into a bunch of people on the street. Boston has over, last I checked, 50 universities, so there's a ton of college students there. College students who think they know everything and want to tell you exactly what they think and why you're wrong, and one person walked off, wouldn't even speak to us, said, "I'm too smart for God," those sorts of things. So we've had our share of discussions with people on the street. Evolution would inevitably come up. And I remember speaking to one gentleman who gave his argument for evolution. I shot it down. He gave another argument for evolution, shot that one down. We went over this over and over again until he finally stopped, shook my hand, and walked off. So what does evolution have to do with Christianity? And is it just college students who care about this? What I want to do first is ask some of the world's leading atheists what evolution has to do with Christianity, and then we'll go to the scriptures. Richard Dawkins, you've already heard of before. This is what he said is the connection between Christianity and atheism and evolution.
Was there a particular point that, or something that you read or an experience you had that sort of said, yeah, this is it, God doesn't exist?
Oh, well, by far the most important, I suppose, was understanding evolution. I think the evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in a way in seeing evolution as the enemy. Whereas the more, what should we say, sophisticated theologians who are quite happy to live with evolution, I think they're deluded. And I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity. And I think I realized that at the age of about 16.
So age 16, Richard Dawkins says what many people at AIG say, but reaches the opposite conclusion. He recognizes that evolution and Christianity are in an all-out war, yet he decides evolution wins. Jerry Coyne is another prominent atheist, evolutionary biologist. He wrote a book against theism, essentially, faith versus fact. And this is what he said about his own upbringing. He said, "I was raised a secular Jew. My vague beliefs in God were abandoned almost instantly. When at age 17, I suddenly realized that there was simply no evidence for the religious claims that I'd been taught. There's no surer route to immersion in the conflict between science and religion than becoming an evolutionary biologist." So deep incompatibility is what Richard Dawkins said. That's what evolution has to do with Christianity. They're at war. Now, the scriptures don't mention Charles Darwin. They don't mention Richard Dawkins. They don't mention Jerry Coyne. They don't mention Darwin's book on the origin of species. But the book of Romans speaks directly to the issue at hand. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. So a passage you're familiar with, I trust, says this, Romans 1:20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen where? Being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that people are without excuse." And it really is abundantly obvious. You don't have to reflect long. Let me make and illustrate this point this way. We spend all sorts of time and energy and money and adulation on the world's best athletes and showcase them every few years in the Olympics and through competitions in between. And what's striking is, think about how much time and effort is exerted into helping athletes swim faster, let's say. And you spend all this engineering and time and science trying to improve this, streamlining it, so forth. And you just take a few minutes of reflection on what's in nature, animals, and the amount of engineering that exists there is remarkable. The majesty of it, the aerodynamic shape of it, the size of it, they're just things that roam our oceans that boggle the imagination. You think about how much time and energy we invest in helping people run faster and the technology involved in that, and then you look to the animal world and boom, there are things that just go so much faster than what we can hope to achieve. Jumping, there are animals that go further. Endurance, the Arctic tern makes a gigantic circle around the globe that puts us to shame. There are things we can't do that we try to engineer solutions to. We can't fly, we aren't built to fly, but we find creative ways to glide and soar, and then the animal world finds ways to do it even better. Or we see that in the animal world. Hover, take flight angles that are normally result in crashes for us. It's not just birds, it's bats, it's the insect world. I happen to personally know one of the world's leading researchers on trying to design a robotic dragonfly, and he told me that just to capture the wing movements of this insect, they had to have a super high-powered camera. You can't capture it otherwise. And they've created a robotic dragonfly. You can imagine the military applications for this. For those of you nerds like me, you can think about just how much fun it would be to play with. But he admits even their best prototypes are still inferior by unambiguous engineering measurements, physics measurements. Their mechanical dragonfly still doesn't hold a candle to what we see in nature. That's how much human effort and engineering and design effort it requires to come close to what we see in nature. And sometimes you look below the surface of what exists out there in the natural world and it just hits you between the eyes. So here's a plant hopper, an insect that has a tremendous springing ability. And if you look below the microscope at what's inside its body, it has gears. These are not put there by people. That's part of the plant hopper's anatomy. So the design of life is abundantly obvious. And what does Paul say, what does God say through Paul in Romans, is the reaction of the pagan world, the a-religious world. It says that Paul says, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth." So the scriptures teach us there are no atheists. Everyone recognizes the design that exists out there. And to say no God, you have to shut down that testimony. You have to actively suppress it. It's not a passive process. And you've probably heard this quote from Richard Dawkins: "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." So even he can't get away from this incontrovertible, unambiguous fact of life. Life looks designed. But he says that's a mirage, and it's an illusion. Your eyes are deceiving you. Now, this isn't just an interesting academic discourse. This connects directly to the gospel, and here's how. Romans 1 gives us a chain of events, and what we've just read is the beginning of that chain of events. So Paul says, number one, everyone sees the evidence for God in nature. No excuse, and to deny the evidence for God in nature, they have to actively suppress it, push it down, try to silence it. So they don't glorify God as God. They don't glorify him for his omnipotence, for his all-power, his all-knowing, and everything else that's revealed in nature. They don't glorify him as God, and they don't give him thanks for creating the world, for sustaining it. And so God gives them over to all sorts of sins. If you read it, if you're familiar with Romans 1, the end of Romans 1 lists all sorts of sins that characterize our culture. Homosexuality, all sorts of sexual sins, murder, rage, so forth. what our culture is screaming, running headlong towards is the end of Romans chapter 1. And Romans 1 says it comes from these earlier sins. People in churches, in the churches I grew up in, I still don't naturally think of failure to glorify God as a big deal. But Romans 1 says that is the most fundamental sin of humanity, and that is what precipitates God's wrath and necessitates Jesus' death on the cross and our need for a Savior. So to deny the testimony of God in nature is to take the foundation for the gospel away, to take the foundation for what should be man's response away. So to teach people they need a Savior, you have to teach them they have a problem. And the most fundamental reason they have a problem, the reason God is angry with them, is because they have not glorified God as God, they've not given him thanks. It's taken me a long time to warm up to this, to realize how big of a deal those two sins are. So there's a direct connection. What is evolution? Evolution is one of the most prominent Western ways to suppress the truth about God and nature and commit these fundamental sins and send people headlong on the way to hell. So there's a direct connection between evolution and Christianity. But is it just college students? No. Paul is talking about all the pagan world. What I want to do now, though, is see how skeptics do this. How do they suppress the truth about God and nature? What are the sorts of things you might encounter on the street? I give you an illustration from Boston, but having done this and been in the creation evolution debate for 10 years professionally and familiar with it even longer before that, I can tell you that skeptics share notes. The arguments they use fall into a few small categories, and we're going to walk through the major ones, and you'll probably hear it the next time you engage someone, they bring up evolution. They're going to bring up these points. There are some points that are over 40 years old. In fact, their last resort in any discussion, and I'll tell it to you here at the end, their last resort is an argument that is several decades old and goes back to legal decisions that were made in the early 80s. So let's think about this together. How do skeptics suppress the truth of God and nature, specifically with evolution? Richard Dawkins again. He wrote a book in 2009, I think it was, to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's works, and this is what he says about the evidence for evolution. One of the ways in which he suppresses the truth about God and nature.
This is the metaphor of a detective coming on the scene of a crime after it's happened. He can't see the crime, but he knows from looking at all the clues that remain that so-and-so did it. It's like that with scientists and evolution. We can't see evolution happening because we don't live long enough. But we look at the clues that remain, and they all overwhelmingly point to the same conclusion. Evolution is a fact.
And of course, Richard Dawkins is well known for the vocabulary he employs to argue against creationists and people who reject evolution. Who are they? He says they're history deniers, just like people who deny the Holocaust. That's what creationists are. So if you believe God created the world, history denier, that's your label. Jerry Coyne said something similar. So Dawkins says the overwhelming evidence points towards evolution, and Coyne has said something similar in the quote we just looked at. He says there's no evidence for religious claims. You've probably heard that if you've done street witnessing, engaged your neighbors. Well, there's no evidence. If they're hardcore atheists, no evidence. There's no reason. God has not revealed himself. Even though we know the scriptures say there's abundant evidence, and they know that there's abundant evidence, what they say is there's no evidence, suppressing the truth. So that's the first category of ways that evolutionists, that skeptics use evolution to suppress the truth. Well, the evidence, the scientific evidence, obviously overwhelmingly supports evolution. You'll hear that. Second category is all around us. Maybe you haven't heard it said explicitly, but you've felt the pressure. Wherever you go and wherever you look, people try to make it seem, or they try to emphasize, that all scientists, basically to a man, agree that evolution is true. Popular scientists, people who claim to be scientists, PhD scientists, and the surveys seem to bear this out. 91% of PhD scientists say humans evolved by natural selection. No guidance by God, no creation. That's a big number. And in fact, you may have heard this statistic thrown about in a discussion in which scientists were complaining about how low the number is among the general populace in the United States. This has been fairly consistent for several decades. Most US adults still don't agree that humans evolved by natural processes. They can't quite warm up to that. Even my unbelieving grandfather in Germany said to me, he thought the idea of coming from an ape was just disgusting and repulsive. Wasn't a Christian, but that to him was unnatural. But there's the numbers. Professional scientists overwhelmingly endorse evolution. And this statistic has been made all the more troubling for the church by a new wave of folks who claim to be Christians and are trying to persuade the church that they should accept evolution. Smiling faces, attractive presentations. These are three members from the theistic evolutionary organization BioLogos. So the current head of the National Institutes of Health, prominent scientific position, Francis Collins, founded this organization for the purpose of persuading the church evolution is true. And so some of the current and past members, staff members, and fellows, on the left there is Dennis Venema, a PhD biologist at Trinity Western University. In the middle is a former staff member, Brad Kramer. He has a Master's of Divinity. Jim Stump on the right is a PhD philosopher. The current president, Deb Harzma, is a PhD physicist and astronomer. And she'll say things like, our primary purpose to all that exists in the natural world should be to praise the one who created it. What can you criticize about that statement? They know how to employ very attractive, evangelical-sounding language to get an audience and then convince them evolution's true. So the overwhelming consensus of scientists that skeptics refer to try to buttress their claims includes people of all stripes, hardcore atheists to professing Christians. In fact, someone said Francis Collins has a testimony that make any Baptist jealous. Seems to be a genuine believer, yet here he is in a prominent position. Evolution's true. That's a way to suppress the truth about God and nature. Second category. Third category. You'll notice in that last statistic, 91% of PhD scientists accept evolution. There are some that do not. So that's something that the evolutionist, the skeptic, has to deal with. How do they do it? Well, here's how Dennis Venema, that biologist I just referred to earlier from BioLogos, professing Christian, yet holds to evolution, this is what he says about those exceptions. He says, it's no exaggeration to say that the very, very few trained biologists who reject common ancestry or evolution, the idea that humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, do so because of prior religious commitments, not for scientific reasons. It's a common view. Well, what about the people in Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research? And what about people who have signed a statement saying they disagree and dissent from Darwin? Well, it's religion. They're religious people, and we can excuse that. They have these strong religious commitments that blinds them and doesn't allow them to recognize what's an obvious fact. Sort of condescending. But it goes even deeper than that, because there are obviously people like me and others who say, no, the reason we oppose evolution, sure, we might invoke religious reasons, but we have strong scientific reasons to reject it. What do the evolutionists do with people like me, people like that, maybe people like you? Randy Isaac was a former member of the BioLogos Advisory Council, so he was a mover and shaker among them, or at least in a leadership position there. He was also the president of the American Scientific Affiliation, the ASA, which is a group of professing Christians in science. From my impression, very few young Earth creationists, but professing Christians in science. And he was the executive director for 10 years. And he did an exit interview in 2016, and this is what he said. The interviewer asked him about a policy of the ASA. So officially, the ASA had a policy of not taking a position in areas of disagreement among Christians. So the interviewer, good interviewer, asked him a question. He said, okay, Dr. Isaacs, does that position apply to things like evolution? There's lots of disagreement among Christians about evolution. And this was his answer. He said the oft-stated American Scientific Affiliation policy not to take a position in areas of honest disagreement among Christians is an extremely important aspect that characterizes the ASA. It's also a most difficult one to maintain. For one thing, it is not easy to differentiate an honest disagreement from a dishonest one. My personal preference, you see where this is going, was that the reference for honest disagreements was the accepted consensus view of the scientific community. I wish I could use that sort of logic. Essentially what he's saying is, if you disagree with the consensus, you are by definition a liar. End of discussion. So there's some people, yeah, religion blinds them to the evidence. There are others who, just by fact that they disagree with the science, they're liars. We can dismiss them that way. Clever, very clever strategy. None of these, though, are the last fallback for the evolutionist. If you've ever been in an extensive discussion with a skeptic, someone who insists on evolution, you're able to shoot down some of their ideas. Eventually, it's going to come down to this. What am I talking about? So let's go back 40-ish years to the early 80s and see a common thread. I'm going to show you a few quotes from books from back then all the way up to close to the present, show you a court decision as well, and there's a common theme in all of these. This is the last resort for the skeptic when trying to suppress the truth about God and nature with evolution. This is Niles Eldredge, a fairly well-known paleontologist, guy who studies fossils. He wrote a book in 1982 called The Monkey Business. A scientist looks at creationism. He says, creation science isn't science at all. Nor have creation scientists managed to come up with even a single intellectually compelling, scientifically testable statement about the natural world. Creation science isn't science. Here's a court case. 1982, there was an Arkansas law that mandated the teaching of creation science. It was not surprisingly challenged in federal court. And then also not surprisingly, the judge overturned it. And this was his reasoning. He said creation science isn't science because, and then he lists 5 characteristics of science. One of it, he says, is it's falsifiable. It's something you can go into the lab and try to disprove. Creation science fails to meet these essential characteristics. And so he said, therefore, it doesn't belong in the science classroom. Fast forward to 2017, the 4th edition of a popular third-year college-level evolutionary biology textbook. Douglas Fatuma and his co-author Kirkpatrick have a whole chapter dedicated to dealing with creation science, how to refute it. And he says the most important feature of scientific hypotheses is that they are testable. And of course, he then concludes creation science isn't testable. So you've probably heard this, because again, this is the final resort for the skeptic. Creationism isn't science. In other words, you can point out flaws in evolution, you can shoot down their arguments, and at some point the discussion flips. Okay, fine, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what you say. If you can't give me something better, we don't need to talk. Creationism isn't science. To me, this is the cleverest tactic of all, because they've taken what is the most abundant, obvious fact about our world, that it looks designed. And again, just by simple analogies to what we value and hold dear and put a lot of time and mental effort and money and energy into, they take that abundant evidence from the natural world and they don't quite say that it's wrong, they say it's stupid in a sophisticated way. When they say creation science isn't science, they're essentially saying you can have your fairy tales, you can have your feel-good stories at night and on Sundays, but when we want to know the world and speak of it in an intelligent way, we do science. And your beliefs aren't part of that. You're stupid. It's a clever tactic. They don't say stupid because that produces an emotional reaction. They just, it's not science. Very clever dismissal. So chances are you're going to run into one of these 5 categories if you talk to someone on the street. Evidence supports evolution. Give me a good reason to believe in God. There's no good reason. And maybe you give them a good reason. Well, next step in that discussion will be, well, okay, well, why do most scientists disagree with you? Explain that. You might point out there's some scientists who still disagree. Well, they're religiously motivated. And some of them are liars. Can't trust them. And let's say you refute that. Well, look, I don't want to discuss with you anymore. Creationism just isn't science. So when it's science, we can continue this discussion. Tends to be how it goes. So that's what evolutionists, skeptics tend to do. Now what? What are Christians to do in response? So what I want to do now is walk you through several categories of replies. And my goal here is not to make everyone PhDs. And I don't say that to be cute and think we're going to do something magical. I'm speaking as someone who's a layperson outside of his field. I've been in discussions. I'm a biology-trained PhD. I'm not a geology or an astronomy PhD. And I've been in discussions where I thought, this guy knows a whole lot more than I do, and I'm in trouble. Now what? Well, there's ways you can discuss with anyone by asking the right questions. You don't need to be a super expert. PhDs are experts in one tiny slice of the knowledge pie and layperson everywhere else. And so what we want to do now is look through simple questions to disarm them. And this is how I'm going to phrase it. How can we destabilize their suppression? So let's think of what we're not trying to do. We're not trying to prove to people that God exists, because they know it. It's That's what Romans 1 says. They know God exists. They're suppressing it. No, it's an active process. So if they're stomping their foot on it, saying no, if you can knock them a little bit off balance, figuratively, you're going to get them to start questioning this. The goal is to knock them off balance so that they return to the most fundamental fact of life, that life looks designed. There is a God who's glorious, who deserves our praise, who deserves our thanks, and we haven't given it, and we're sinners and need a Savior. That's the goal, to get them back to the main subject. Because what are they doing with evolution? Avoiding the main subject. They're suppressing the truth about God and nature because it frees them to do whatever they want. Frees them from having to give God glory. Frees them from having to give Him thanks. People want to run their own lives the way they want to run it. So how do we do that? Just a few simple ways to do this, a few simple points. How do we destabilize this suppression? So I'm going to give you several points stated two different ways. I'm going to make a statement, illustrate it, and then phrase it as a question. Because what am I going to do if I'm talking with some guy who knows a whole lot more about geology than I do, or astronomy than I do, or just any other field of science more than I do? I can't argue the facts with him or try to tell him, well, don't you know, you're wrong, this is what you got to do. I can just ask questions. And there's good questions to ask that will make them rethink and get them to concede things they know to be true. So here's the statement. First way to destabilize their impression, point out that evolution is impossible, and then I'll show you the question you can ask. Why even bring this up? Well, Darwin gave a test of his ideas in 1859. He actually gave a way by which evolution could, at least in theory, be disproved and shown to be false. Evolutionists don't like to talk about this, but let's talk about it. It's a long Victorian sentence. I'll read it and then break it down. So Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. A mouthful of a sentence, how they spoke back then apparently. So let's make it simpler. What he's saying is, if there's any organ out there, basically if you can find anything out there, organs, tissues, species, something, because evolution is trying to explain everything. Find something that you can't form by numerous successive slight modifications. In other words, step by step. So evolutionists, as an example, say birds evolved from dinosaurs. What they don't say is that a T-Rex laid an egg and one day a bird popped out. That would be a big evolutionary leap. What they say is it's step by tiny, almost inscrutable step. Richard Dawkins said you can't see evolution happening. That's just how slow it goes, is what they'd say. But if you can find something you cannot build step by tiny step, my theory would absolutely break down. If you go to evolutionary skeptical discussion boards, they get quite upset when creationists quote this because they say they don't give the next sentence. Well, let's give the next sentence. Darwin says, I can find out no such case. Here's the point, though. Darwin gave a test of evolution, and this is what he needs to give for evolution to be science by the evolutionists' own standards. This is why it's so important. Evolutionists say to creationists, you don't do science because you don't give us a way to disprove your ideas. You just say it's all right. Well, if evolution becomes something that you can never disprove, it's also not science and should not have no place in the discussion. So it's critical that evolutionist skeptics recognize there is a test. Sure, Darwin said 1859 he could find out no such case, but he also said, here's another long sentence, that our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. Huh? What I'm pointing you to is that Darwin knew nothing about genetics. Well, where's genetics in this sentence? You won't find it. Why not? Because the word genetics wasn't even invented until the early 1900s. That's how backwards our thinking was on basic laws of heredity in 1859. Sure, Darwin could find nothing in 1859 that disproved his idea, but there was a ton he didn't know. So it's well worth our while to see if there's anything today that cannot be built step by tiny step. And again, you don't need to be a PhD. There's a long-standing, vexing evolutionary problem that any child can see, any student can see. Much of life exists in male and female. Current cultural debates about that notwithstanding, we're talking basic biological facts that you can't deny. Every scientist who does biology knows there's male and female. There's not a continuum. And evolution has to explain that step by tiny, unobservable step. So presumably then, at some point, a female evolves, or maybe the male evolves first, doesn't really matter. But one comes before the other, and supposedly then the other gender comes along. But there's the problem. What's the male to do for millions of years waiting for the female to come along? How can he reproduce himself? How can he pass on his DNA? How can he keep evolution going? It's a dead end. How can the female keep evolution going if there's no male around? The evolutionists know this is a problem, and it gets even, that's a gross oversimplification, because we now know, because Darwin didn't, now we know genetics and all the very tiny molecular components that when sperm meets egg, this piece has to meet this piece like lock and key or it won't happen, and it's so much more complex than that. So if you're engaging an evolutionist, that's the fact to keep in mind. Evolution is impossible. But if you're engaging someone who knows a lot of biology, or at least pretends to know a lot of biology, just ask a question. How do you explain the origin of male and female? At this point, they'll probably start backpedaling. They're not going to admit it's been disproven. They'll just say, well, we don't have a good answer yet, but we will. You don't need to disprove them. You don't need to win the argument at this point. The point is destabilize, because they know God exists. They're trying to shut it down, and they think they're pretty smart for doing so. If you just reminded them that they're not quite as smart as they think they are, well, now you're going to keep them awake at night. Second line of evidence. And you want to do it with humility and grace. All of us would be there were not for the grace of God. But the point is to get them rethinking what they desperately hold to be true, what they actively get up every morning and say, no. Well, how do you explain the origin of male and female? I don't want you to forget about that. You got to think about it, because that's what your whole faith rests on. Your eternity rests on your ability to explain that question. Second response to this. Second way of destabilizing their suppression. Again, I'll make this statement, I'll give you a few illustrations, and then we'll go back to the question you can ask. And you'll see there's a progression here that hopefully leads them to really having to rethink what they say. Again, you can't convince them necessarily that to embrace Christianity, because they're waking up every day saying, no, it's a decision. But you can give them the evidence to rethink that decision and exhort them to trust Christ. What do I mean the best evidence for evolution is ambiguous? I want to walk you through leading textbook examples of evolution, and it's not exhaustive. It doesn't need to be exhaustive. All you have to do is show a few examples that what people say is the overwhelming evidence for evolution, like Richard Dawkins says, isn't as cut and dry as they think. And as we illustrate this, I'll show you what I mean. Evidence number one. What is the overwhelming evidence for evolution? Well, it happens. It's not even something to debate about the past. We can see it right before our very eyes. Natural selection happens. Survival of the fittest happens. Are you just a reality denier? What are they talking about? Let me give you one example of this statement. In the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, there's a bunch of finch species that exist there and nowhere else in the world. They're called Darwin's finches because he was responsible for introducing them to the scientific community in the early 1800s, after he took his voyage around the globe on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. They didn't get evolutionary fame until long after Darwin died. Okay, new species, whoop-de-doo. The reason they have prominence in the creation-evolution debate is because of a British couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who went to the Galapagos in the 1970s and have been doing very meticulous scientific studies of these birds. One in particular, the medium ground finch, which you find on Daphne Major, an island you can't even see in this image, but you can see where in that archipelago it exists. So this medium ground finch, which has a certain beak size and shape, they've been studying intensely for 40 years. So you go to the island and tag the birds and watch them for a summer. Science can sometimes be glamorized. A lot of it is sweaty, hard, boring work. So they've been doing sweaty, hard, boring work for 4 decades. And this is what gets everyone so excited. In this single finch species, there's a little bit of variety in their beak size. Now, some have said the only people who can detect that difference are Peter Grant and God. But it's there, it's measurable. It's less than a millimeter. That little bit of difference is enough to affect the finch's diet. So the finches with a slightly skinnier beak do not have the beak power to crack certain types of seeds and nuts. So they'll preferentially eat this type of plant. The finch with a slightly bigger bill has just enough force to crack some of these bigger seeds, so it subsists on something else. Well, what happens in 40 years of watching these tiny differences? Well, if you're on the Galapagos, there are certain years where drought ensues, there are certain years of El Nino and heavy rainfall. What's that going to do? Well, plants depend on water and sunlight. Okay, so drought is going to affect plant life. And it just so happens that the plants which produce the smaller seeds are not as drought tolerant. So those dominoes start falling. Rainfall drops off, plants start dropping off, birds start dropping off. And the ones with the bigger beaks, which can consume those plants that have survived, themselves then survive. And what the grants have seen over many years is changes in the average beak size of the finches in response to changes in the environment. When the drought happens, certain plants die out, certain finches die out. The ones that survive have a different average beak size. When the reverse occurs in the plants and the environment, the reverse occurs in the finches. That's the evidence. That's the overwhelming evidence that evolution occurs. Natural selection happens, we can see it. I'm saying this evidence is ambiguous. And here's why. Science isn't a process by which we prove things. Unfortunately, many medical doctors, you go to get a checkup, you go to get some sort of medicine, let me give you something proven. Typically, we don't use the term proven in science. We reserve that for philosophy and logic. Proven in philosophy and logic is you state some premise. All mammals are animals. Then you have a next statement. Zebras are mammals, therefore, and you use the rules of logic to make some conclusion. Therefore, zebras are animals. That's just a simple example. But that's how you can prove something if you've got a specific logical sequence. Science doesn't work that way because we don't know what the premise is. If we knew the premise that would allow us to deduce the cure for cancer, it wouldn't be a scourge in our culture anymore. It wouldn't be a scourge around the globe. We don't know what the premise is. We don't have a rule of life from which we can derive a conclusion. We have to discover it. So science really works the opposite way. You go out into the world, you make some observations, you take a guess as to why the world operates the way it does, you take a guess as to what causes cancer, you take a guess as to what might cure cancer, and then you do an experiment. And the goal of the experiment is not to prove that your guess is true, it's to disprove every other competing idea. For example, you got a new idea, you just went to the Amazon, you isolated some new compound from some rare foreign tree. This might cure cancer. So you go into the clinic and you give one group of patients with cancer the new drug, the other group of patients, well, let's just say you just do it on one set of patients, and they're cured. Well, a competing explanation is that this was just a chance fluke event. You have to disprove that hypothesis before you conclude that you found a cure. It may be that it only cures one type of cancer. So now you've got to test in other people to disprove that sort of hypothesis. Science works by disproof. That's the point. Science works by disproof. So in the creation-evolution debate, someone wants to say science shows evolution is true. The first question we should ask is, have you eliminated every single competing explanation? Someone says, well, Darwin's finches demonstrate evolution is true. It's overwhelmingly obvious. Well, does it eliminate competing explanations? Is this evidence, does this disprove the Bible? No. Ever since God cursed the creation in Genesis 3, ever since Adam and Eve sinned, death, predation, carnivory, all of that has been occurring in endless cycles since then. Survival of the fittest, that happens ever since the curse. So the problem with evolutionists using this argument is not that there's something inherently flawed with it. The problem is it doesn't disprove creation. So if you've got an observation and two ideas equally explain it well, scientifically you can't say anything. You don't know. Nothing you can say. That's one example. Same song, second verse. They'll give an example, let's say, of a new species forming, back to Darwin's finches. This is a recent discovery. In the last, it was just published January of last year. So same couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, have been studying this medium ground finch. In the early 80s, a male of one species came and mated with females of a different species. One of the results of this breeding event in the early 80s was a set of finches, a set of offspring that became genetically distinct. The Grants were taking blood samples and got the DNA from these offspring. They were physically distinct and reproductively distinct. Hard to believe, but these big bird individuals build nests on the same island, probably just feet from the medium ground finch, but they don't interbreed. Basically, everything that defines a new species has now been observed, and the Grants announced this in January of 2018 in Science magazine, one of the leading journals in the world. See, creationists, in fact, I was made aware of this fact by certain evolutionary blogs dancing and saying, see, look we can rub this in the creationist's face. We can't even, there's no debate anymore. Look, we've disproved it all. Well, does it disprove creation? That's the question in any scientific debate. What does it disprove? Does it eliminate creation? What does the Bible actually say? The Bible doesn't teach that God creates species. Unfortunately, some English translations use that term. The key question is, what does the Hebrew say? And the relevant term in Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 6, and the flood is the Hebrew term mean. It's used 31 times in Scripture. God creates creatures according to their mean. Noah's commanded to bring 2 of every land-dependent, air-breathing creature according to their mean. Kind is typically what you see in English. God creates creatures according to their kind. To make a long story short, and if we had more time, I could justify this more rigorously, kind is not the same thing as species, not the same thing as the next level up of classification, genus, but it's probably the level of family. What do I mean? So in this example right here, down at the bottom of the screen, the red fox is today classified as a species. The Arctic fox, the white guy there next to him at the genus level, is a separate species, and you can see they're very distinct. But they're so distinct that scientists even place them each in its own genus. That's how different they are. Well, Arctic foxes, red foxes, dogs, wolves, coyotes, so forth, not only are they separate species, but they're part of the same family. There's a certain set of characteristics they have in common that lead scientists to say, yeah, separate species, but same family. Why am I explaining all this? Because that's the level of classification that's probably the best rule of thumb for what Genesis 1 is talking about, Genesis 6 is talking about when it uses the term kind. So let's think about this. God says to Noah, bring 2 of every kind on board the ark. He doesn't say species. So Noah's not bringing 2 Arctic foxes, 2 red foxes, 2 Dalmatians, 2 Great Danes, 2 wolves, 2 coyotes, and so forth. He's bringing 2 representatives of that entire family. Well, where do the species come from? The 30-plus species of dogs and foxes and wolves and so forth. Canidae is the family, the canid kind, technical scientific term. Where do all these guys come from? And there's over 300 breeds of dogs. Where do they come from? All from that common pair on board the ark. The Bible implies many new species have formed since the flood. The Equidae family includes zebras, horses, donkeys. There's 3 living species of zebras. There's 1 wild species of horse. There's 3 wild species of donkeys or asses. And there's over 850 breeds of horses and donkeys on farms and ranches. All of those come from a common pair on board the ark. Lots of change the Bible permits in just a few thousand years. But there's a new species of Darwin's finches that formed. That's exactly what the Bible expects. So once again, same song, second verse, this particular evidence, evolution explains, creation explains, we're stuck. Science cannot tell you which one is correct. It doesn't disprove either. That's what I mean by the science is ambiguous. So 0 for 2 now, and in terms of evolution's attempt to say this is overwhelming evidence for evolution. Here's a favorite example. It's been vexing people for 150 years, from Darwin all the way up to the present day. Transitional forms exist. And let me just circumvent the whole debate about whether or not a certain fossil is a transitional form. What I'm going to show you is a way to just shortcut this whole debate and move on to something else. Let's just, for sake of argument, say that this fossil, Tiktaalik, I'm going to let the evolutionists have it. Let's just say, yeah, sure, I'll let you have your transitional form. Here's an artist's reconstruction, which has a head that looks kind of like an amphibian or a reptile, and the back end of this creature has scales and tail like a fish. And I'm happy to say, evolutionists, go ahead and have it. I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm just going to avoid all those discussions of fossils. I'll let you place it in a sequence from fish-like creatures to land-like creatures. Go ahead, have it. The question is, does it disprove creation? Now, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, you will not see a list of the creatures that God created. You'll see categories. Day 5, God creates the creatures in the oceans, the creatures in the air. Day 6, the creatures of the land, domestic and wild, creates man on day 6, but not a long, comprehensive, scientific, pleasing list. Scientists, God didn't write it for the PhDs so that they know exactly what he created. He gave us the categories. Okay, why does that matter? Well, God says on day 6, he makes man in his own image. Theologians debate that. Whatever it means, there's something about you and me that reflects something about God. So let's do this. Let's look at what humans have done, what humans have designed, the types of things they've designed, because that might give us some insight into what God did in Genesis chapter 1, because we're made in his image. I'm going to use a military example. U.S. military engineers have done a tremendous job designing ships to transport firepower from the east and west coasts, from Hawaii, Alaska, so forth, to any place in the globe. We've seen the success of our fleet, the Navy, time and time again. Very well designed for doing that purpose, transporting firepower through the world's oceans. This thing would be a sitting duck if you stuck it on land and tried to win a tank battle. Couldn't go anywhere. It'd be blown to smithereens. It's not a bad design, it's just not designed for land. It's designed for the oceans. If you want to have a battle on land, you design a tank, which are very effective and do the job they're designed to do. You stick these guys in the ocean, they'll sink like a rock, drown the men inside, and be totally useless. It's not because they're poorly designed, they're not designed to be ships. But what if you're in the US and you need to fight a battle thousands of miles away, you've got to cross the ocean to get there, and you've got to eventually move firepower from the oceans to the land and back, and get it back to the United States. A tank's not going to get you there through the oceans. The ship isn't going to get you very far once you reach land. What instead you design is a transitional form that blends the features of ships and tanks and is perfectly designed for the transitional environment between water and land. It's not the type of thing you want to take from California to the Persian Gulf. It's not the type of thing you want leading you into battle on the land, but is the perfect design for going between the two. So I'm happy to let the evolutionists have his transitional form. Doesn't eliminate creation, which means it's useless to the creation-evolution debate. Those are probably the top 3 evidences you'll hear. Evolutionists are continually inventing new ones, but this is what shows up in textbooks, and if the textbooks can't get it right, what will? The evidence is ambiguous. It doesn't distinguish between creation and evolution. So what I've just done is given you the justification for this statement. Let's say you're dealing with someone who has a pretense of knowing all sorts of biology. Ask a question. Did you know that the major evidences for evolution are perfectly consistent with Genesis? What are they going to do then? The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Well, it fits creation. Oh, now what? What are they going to do? Now you've set them backwards in a major way. By this time, if not earlier, they'd probably say, well, you're saying all these people are wrong. I was just on the BioLogos forum the other day. They have an online way of interacting, and they have a linguist who's a moderator, believes in evolution, a professing Christian Bible translator. And she brought that up the other day. Well, I just don't, you got to be kind of kooky to think that all these scientists must be wrong. Is there a conspiracy? I've experienced this personally when engaging mainstream media. What they usually do, if they talk to me, most of them don't want to, because, we're either religiously biased or liars. It doesn't fit the agenda. Those few that do, and I can think of someone here local, had his pen and paper and said, so you're a scientist, you don't accept evolution. What do you do with all your colleagues? Is it a mass conspiracy to suppress the truth, or do we throw out science? Do you want to have bad door number 1 or bad door number 2? Pick your poison. Great way to set it up. And I said, neither. And then he put down his pen and didn't take any notes as I explained my view. That's how it goes. Let me illustrate what I mean. I said here, the consensus is not qualified to adjudicate the debate. That's the statement. I'll illustrate it and then give you the question to ask and then return to my journalistic exchange. Let's say we were trying to answer a different question. Let's say the question was, how is the globe illuminated? And let's say there's a group of scientists who've lived in an underground, windowless, enclosed laboratory environment in which they eat, drink, sleep, work, and have born and died. Their whole life has always been in this enclosed, windowless environment. That's all they know. And you march down there and say, please tell me, scientific consensus, how is the globe illuminated? And they're going to say to a man, well, with fluorescent light bulbs, of course, because that's all they know. It's a silly example. You might say, well, don't you know the world's illuminated by sunshine? Oh, no, there's an overwhelming consensus in this room. All of us scientists agree it's fluorescent light bulbs. Obvious, and you're stupid if you don't think otherwise. Well, don't you know that, haven't you ever stepped outside this room to test the hypothesis that maybe there's sunlight that illuminates the globe? How do you know there's no sunlight? There's just this consensus. You can see how silly this idea is. These people who've lived and been cloistered in this isolated environment and never explored the globe. It's foolish for them to insist, and it means nothing if all of them agree. The parallel to what we see in the mainstream world is this. Even though there are prominent celebrities, all sorts of scientists who insist that evolution is true, and here's the evidence, here's the question to ask. How many of the professional scientists in the United States, around the globe, doesn't matter where, how many of them go through their junior high education, high school education, undergraduate education, PhD education, in all those years of training, how many times have they been required to read a creationist technical paper? There's only one answer they can give because of the legal environment in which we live. They're forbidden to do that. Can't teach creation in the classroom. In other words, the United States and so many other countries have made a mint churning out people who've lived in a cloistered environment and are never exposed to anything else their entire lives. I've written about this in an article you can find on our website, Why Don't More People Accept the Young Earth View of Speciation? This is what I tell the journalists. Neither of those two poisonous doors. There's not a conspiracy, because they want you to say that because it looks foolish to their readers. They want you to say throw out science because that's another form of conspiracy that looks foolish to their readers. They want you to say something that makes you look stupid. I said, neither. I said, scientists don't know that other ideas exist. It's simply ignorance, which is why he put down his pen and didn't take any notes, because it's true, but doesn't want his readers to hear that. And talk about it more in my book. I'll tell you about the book later. But this is the point. The consensus, overwhelming as it is essentially an isolated cloister of people who've, for whatever reason, you can invoke a conspiracy. I don't care what you invoke. It's just an empirical fact that all the scientists around this country go through their education and are never required once, with hardly any exceptions that I know of, to read the other side. So how can they say evolution's true and creation's false? They don't even know what creation says. So here's the question you can ask. How do you explain the origin of male and female? Do you know that all the major lines of evidence for evolution are consistent with creation? Okay, those are my favorite missiles against what you're saying. Know what I'm going to do? Well, everyone believes it. How many of those people that you've put your faith in and trust know what creationists actually believe? How many of them have been educated in the other side? They're stuck now. That's why this last resort comes in. Well, I don't have an answer for you today, but your stuff just isn't scientific, so come up with something scientific. Thank you, I'd be glad to. There's the fourth point. Creationism has met and exceeded the gold standard of science. What's enshrined in federal law is factually false. Creation makes testable predictions. There are statements that flow from Scripture that scientists have derived that you can go out into a laboratory and test. There are things we can derive from Scripture for which we do not yet know the answer, that experiments will reveal the answer to. Let me give you one example. We just talked about this idea of kinds, the family level of animals taken on board the ark. This would be mammals like elephants, giraffes, zebras, reptiles like snakes and lizards, amphibians, frogs and salamanders and so forth, birds, and you've seen some of the kinds we've depicted out there in the Ark Encounter. And if you haven't, please go see it. They're fantastic, fantastic sculptures and such. Well, those are the ancestors. Tens of thousands of new species have formed from these kinds since the flood. So if you add up the number of living species in mammals and amphibians and reptiles and birds, there's over 30,000. I'm just giving you the background to this so you can see what flows from this. And these kinds exited the ark about 4,500-ish years ago. So tens of thousands of new species in 4,500 years. Very few evolutionists are aware of what creationists hold to. Some of the rare exceptions, the few evolutionists who are aware of this, just think this is ridiculous. They use this statement as a way to attack creation. That's impossible. You can't have tens of thousands of new species in a few thousand years. We should see species forming all the time. We don't. Let's put some more hard numbers on this, just focusing now on birds. We've talked about Darwin's finches. We'll come back to them in a moment. And let's give some context, bigger context for birds. So there's 11,000 bird species recognized by science today, from toucans to flamingos to hawks and falcons and so forth. 11,000, ton of them. Just to keep the math simple, let's say that all of these 11,000 bird species formed at a constant rate, in a regular way, since the flood. They could have formed very quickly after the flood, and the rate has tapered off. There's all sorts of ways you can think about this. Let's just keep the math simple and say it's been constant. That's 4,500 years ago, the flood. So 11,000 species divided by 4,500 years. Here's your average rate of forming new species, 2.4 new bird species per year. Ah, ridiculous! That's what the evolutionist says. There's no way that can be true. And here's why. What do the evolutionists say is the rate of new species? They say, yeah, there's 11,000 bird species alive today, but those have taken millions of years to form. They say they evolved from dinosaurs. They say, again, it's not that the T-Rex laid an egg and out popped a bald eagle. Long period of time, transitional forms. Dinosaurs go extinct in their time scale 65 million years ago. If you look at their literature, they'll say birds started evolving. Modern birds started evolving about 35 million years ago, so we'll use that number. 35 million years divided by 11,000 species is one new species every 3,000 years. So even mainstream archaeologists will say King David lived 3,000 years ago. So they say one new species every King David. That's how slow it is. And again, just to put these numbers next to each other, 2.4 new bird species per year times 3,200 years gives you 7,000 to 8,000 new species. So that's a big difference. One new species every 3,000 years, 7,000 new species every 3,000 years. That's big difference. That's why the evolutionists just, it's crazy. They guffaw at it. That's nuts. That's a testable prediction. We can go out there and start doing measurements to see if this is true. These are the types of predictions I've put in print a couple years ago. So the 1982 court decision that says creation doesn't make falsifiable predictions is factually false. The last resort for the skeptic is based on a falsehood. It gets even better, though. Remember that new bird species that Peter and Rosemary Grant found? What I didn't do is give you the math. So today, there are 18 species of Darwin's finches that are recognized by science, plus this new one now. First ones were added to our scientific repertoire 1837. That's after Darwin gets back to the UK. It's about 181 years ago. One new species discovered in 181 years. I'm just going to assume, to keep the math simple, that no other new species have formed, just this one that was published last year. Well, 1 divided by 100 is 0.01 new species per year. 1 divided by 200 is 0.005 new species per year. Both of those numbers are a whole lot less than 1 and a whole lot less than 2.4. So maybe we've falsified my prediction. Hold on. The prediction that I just gave you was for the whole globe, that some species, 2 to 3 species somewhere in the globe this year, will form a new one. So to compare apples to apples, you have to apply a correction factor. The 1 divided by 181 is a local rate for the Galapagos. To convert it to a global rate, you have to apply this correction factor. 1 divided by 181 divided by 18 times 11,000. So let's put these numbers all in a row. Evolutionists say 1 new bird species every King David, or 0.0003 new bird species per year. Super slow. And the creationist prediction, by contrast, is super fast, 2.4 new bird species per year. Well, Darwin's finches, 1 new species divided by 181 years, divided by 18 times 11,000 gives you 3.4 new bird species per year. Exactly in line with what's predicted, even faster. It's like this. Let's say the NFL continues its existence to the year 2050. And I say, it's 2019, I'm going to predict for you who's going to play in the Super Bowl. I'm going to tell you the two teams that are going to play, and I'm going to tell you the final score. And lo and behold, the NFL survives that long, political debates notwithstanding. There's a Super Bowl that happens, the two teams that I predicted show up, and the final score is very close to mine. I'm off by a field goal. People would say, well, how did you do that? Well, I can't. That's why I'm making it up. But let's say that was true. You'd say that was amazing. The fact that these numbers are that close is amazing. Not only do creationists make things and make statements you can test, those are working. They're working. Creationists have made successful, testable scientific predictions. You can say, are you aware that creationists have made testable, successful predictions? Or my favorite, not that I'm biased because I wrote the book, have you read Replacing Darwin? And I bring that up because most evolutionists are loath to read any creationist material. Not only do they say the consensus rejects creation, the consensus who's not read creationist material, they will refuse to read it because they can't stand giving money to creationist organizations. It's this big catch-22 they've caught themselves in. Well, you're not science. No, what we are. Have you read this? No, I'm not going to read it. Well, how can you say that? And round we go. By this point, hopefully you've destabilized them and given them something to think about. They might not turn around and be converted, but people who are saying no when they wake up in the morning now have a whole lot more to think about. And if you do it in a winsome way, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, we start off life unbelievers. Some of us, and if we had time to share testimonies, we'd probably have people who said, I was that arrogant person, and it was the loving, gentle, consistent testimony of someone who won me over. Some people it takes years, some people it takes an instant, and they're born again after someone witnesses to them. Hopefully what you've seen here, though, is something that prepares you for what you're going to hear on the street. Evolution is a direct attack on Christianity. That's why the skeptics all embrace it. It's a way for them to justify suppressing the truth about God and nature in a way that makes them feel intellectually satisfied. And there's typical categories they invoke that have been pretty consistent for decades. There's really no surprises that you'll run into. They might have different examples from year to year, but the categories of their arguments are the same. Well, all the evidence supports evolution. And all the intellectual scientists, or the professional scientists accept evolution. Those few exceptions, they're just religiously motivated, or they're just liars. There's liars who are out there today. You got to watch out for them. And lastly, you're stupid. They don't say it that way. They just say creation's not science. How can we destabilize that? Just ask questions. Well, how do you explain the origin of male and female? Well, it's an unsolved question. We're working on it right now. Okay. And again, you don't need to have an aha gotcha moment. The goal is to get them thinking, get them rethinking. Well, did you know that the textbook evidences for evolution and more are equally consistent with Genesis? No. And maybe they bring up an example. No, it's consistent. Well, and now they're backpedaling. And did you know the consensus is not qualified? Or if you ask the question, how many of the PhD friends, or how many of your favorite authors, how many Richard Dawkins type people, has Jerry Coyne, if they've idolized Jerry Coyne, has Jerry Coyne read the creationist literature? And you can see from his published works he hasn't. He's still, the few times he actually tries to engage with creation science, he's engaging with 1859 views. There's no idea that we believe in kinds. Doesn't make any attempt, any effort to engage what professional creationists actually say. And then you bring it home and say, are you aware of what creationists actually say? Have you read the creationist books? It's probably not what you think it is. And if they say no, or if they say, well, have you read the evolutionary literature? Doesn't matter. They're the ones arguing for it. And if they want to be intellectually consistent, they need to have read the other side and be aware of it. I have read the other side, and you can say that. There are creationists who've read the other side. In fact, let me give you an example. Darryl Falk is one of the staff members, I think, still at the BioLogos organization. He's a PhD biologist, very sweet man, and projects that sort of syrupy Christian sweetness, kumbaya type thing, wherever he goes, to give an evangelical appeal. And he and I were speaking at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting a couple of years ago, and we're supposed to sort of talk about, I think it was the origin of Adam and Eve. And he said he would agree to do it on one condition: if he met me for lunch several months in advance so we could establish a Christian relationship in Christ. Okay? So we met for 4 hours, just here locally. And it was just a very cordial, happy, friendly affair. And he said, no secrets in the kingdom, we'll just tell you what's going on, and buttering up, that sort of thing. So about 3.5 hours in, he said, no secrets in the kingdom, let me just sketch for you the scientific points I'm going to make in a few months so there's no surprises. He'd start the argument, and I'd finish it, because creationists actually read the other side, and they're not afraid of it. Then I showed him my scientific evidence, and the discussion immediately changed, and it was over very quickly, and it ended being friendly syrupy. And I think it's because most evolutionists don't bother to read the other side. They must be religious or liars. They do not entertain the notion that there are actually people who've read this, engaged in it, and don't find it satisfying. People are suppressing the truth. Now, I wrote this book, Replacing Darwin. People say authors tell you, I'm told by other authors, you always ultimately write for yourself. And that was true in my case. I wrote the book that I wish I had when I was a student. I wrote the book I wish I had when I was out there street witnessing, to say, hey, if you're actually serious about engaging this issue, Mr. Skeptic, read this. It's designed to be something you don't have to read, you just hand it out. It's science, chapters 1 through 10, with the gospel at the end. It's assuming an audience who doesn't believe creation is true. So we're Answers in Genesis. Our primary target audience is people who say, yes, I believe the Bible is true, but what about the cavemen and the dinosaurs? People are asking questions. And so we give them answers. This is written for people who aren't asking any questions. That question about the origin of man, the origin of species, that was settled 150 years ago. And the only smart people alive today endorse Darwin's view. Don't bother me with this. So what this book tries to do from cover to cover is create curiosity, destabilize. Hey, there's something you haven't thought of. Oh, wait a minute. And establish credibility. Because they think creationists are stupid. They think they've heard all the answers. They think there's no questions. That's the goal of this book, in hopes that it'll be a step towards their salvation. I won't bother with the details here. You can get it out back if there's someone you want to give it to, or you're talking to someone on the street and they can't stand sending money to Answers in Genesis. Well, buy it on Amazon. Who cares? There's other ways to get it. I've set up a Facebook page for the purpose of engaging people. People talk about safe spaces in today's culture. I wanted this to be a safe space. Skeptics can come in and say, you're wrong for this reason. Okay, let's talk about it. I highly encourage you to keep up with our website, because as new ideas come out, Creationist does make testable predictions, which means future observations will reveal things about what we've said. And so I wrote the book in 2017. That Darwin's finches thing came out after the book was published, and so I wrote it up, not in the book because it was published, but on our website. Thank you so much for your attention here today. I hope this enables you to engage people on the street.